Welcome to WMNF 88.5 FM and WMNF.org. You're listening to the Tuesday Café with Seán Kinane. The 4-year anniversary of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting is coming up on Monday. Later on in the show, we're going to talk about school safety with the father of one of the victims. He's president of Stand With Parkland, the National Association of Families for Safe Schools. So I hope you stick around and keep with us for that discussion. But first up, we're going to take another look at the USF Forest Preserve. Joining us now by Zoom is Dr. Jeannie Munger, a member of Save USF Forest Preserve. She recently earned her doctorate degree from the Department of Integrative Biology at USF. She's also on the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee, which has just come up with recommendations for the area that includes the Forest Preserve and a golf course. Welcome back to WMNS Tuesday Cafe, Jeannie.
Thank you for having me.
So glad you could join us. So before we get too deep into the show, some people might not know about the USF Forest Preserve. Where is it and why do you think it's ecologically and academically important?
It is located just north of the main USF Tampa campus, across the street from that campus on Fletcher Avenue. And it abuts Lettuce Lake Park, as well as the USF golf course that's known as the Claw. It is about 700 or so acres, 650 acres, depending on how you slice it, of imperiled habitats, predominantly wetland, but also imperiled sandhill habitat, and some of the last sandhill habitat remaining in Hillsborough County. And it boasts an incredible diversity of wildlife, both plant and animal. Several gopher tortoises live there, among other endangered and threatened species.
And this last year, the university put out this request for, it wasn't proposals necessarily, it was just a request for information about what might they do with this property. And some developers wrote up proposals for it. And so as a result of all of that, there was formed this North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee. And you were selected as one of the student members of that committee. What brought that committee about and how are you involved?
Well, I think what brought that committee about was former President Stephen Carell stepping down from his post and the Board of Trustees appointing now interim President Law to serve in his position. And I think President Law has done a nice job taking this matter up and taking it into consideration. In addition to forming this North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee, she also had an independent ecological assessment conducted on both the Forest Preserve and the adjacent golf course to ascertain its ecological value. And essentially the charge of this committee was to review that document and provide recommendations about both of these parcels, which collectively are known as the North Fletcher property.
And they recently, maybe as recently as Friday, came up with their draft recommendations, and they sent those to USF's interim president, Rhea Law, on Friday. What were some of those recommendations that were in what they recommended?
Sure. So the recommendations that were specific to the Forest Preserve were to hire a full-time facilities manager for not just the Forest Preserve, but 2 other green spaces that are on the USF campus, and that would be the Botanical Garden and what we call the Geopark, which is not well known to most people, but it is a piece of land that is used by several departments for teaching and research on the campus proper. In addition to that, the recommendation stated that a more formalized Forest Preserve Advisory Board should come under the purview of the College of Arts and Sciences. So the College of Arts and Sciences already has sort of jurisdiction, if you will, over the Forest Preserve and Botanical Garden and the Geopark. But I think that in previous years, the Forest Preserve has not been, its status has not been well elevated, I'll say that. And so this idea is then to use the College of Arts and Sciences to kind of elevate its profile and make sure that both the university and the community are aware that this place is here.
Going back to the facilities manager that they recommend, that's something that you've been advocating for as long as I've been talking to you about this, that you think that there should be somebody in charge of kind of protecting this place.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that recommendation predates me by several decades, actually. The Integrative Biology Department produced a white paper, I believe in 2001, which called for a similar sort of land manager post to be created to oversee the forest preserve. And so in my esteem, having this in the recommendation, and as I understand it, Dean Eric Eisenberg is very willing to release funding for this full-time facilities manager. This is a big win. You know, aside from the immediate threats of development, not managing the ecosystems properly can also be a death sentence for them.
And in this, I just want to remind people that we're speaking with Dr. Jeannie Munger. She's a member of Save USF Forest Preserve. She also is on the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee, and it's just come up with recommendations for the area that includes the forest preserve that's north of campus and a golf course that's north of campus. And so we're talking right now about those recommendations. And in this document, it says that USF's decisions about properties, here's a quote, should effectively weigh and balance the benefits of developing revenue-generating projects with the preservation of natural areas. People were kind of wondering if that was a priority when we first heard about this request for ideas, request for some thoughts about what to do with this property. Was this university just interested in making money, or was it also interested in protecting the environment? And so this in these recommendations, it kind of weighs in heavily that protecting it as nature seems to be an important thing.
Yes, and in addition to the recommendation document, we also produced a guiding principles document. And the purpose of that document was so that any future development interests or ideas that might take place on USF properties would take not just the ecological value of the space into consideration, but also its cultural value. It's well known that across the Tampa campus, including on the golf course and of course in the forest preserve, that there are not just indigenous burial grounds, but also significant archaeological sites. And so taking those things into consideration before development takes place is what we are asking for. And we're asking for the university to do that in the future, not just on these properties, but any property. So I think that is an important aspect of these recommendations that we've provided. Some of my concerns are that, in this interest to balance sort of the economic needs of the university, that this recommendation has not strongly enough called for protection of this forest preserve specifically.
And you said yesterday you wrote a letter to President Law, and that was in your words to formally enter into the record my dissent of the recommendation provided to you by this committee. You said that, and maybe I'm paraphrasing what you just told us here, is that you said it does not adequately address long-term protections. And so you think that as much as they talk about protecting the environment here in this document, there's not enough that's being done to protect it yet. So what else would need to be done?
Yeah, that's correct. I think I'll start by saying this, that I know that many other people on the committee have a lot of faith in the university as an institution. I have less faith personally, given that the university is the institution that brought forth this RFI in the first place, and it wasn't the first time the university had eyed this space for development interests. So my opinion is that a conservation easement or some other legal document is the only way to truly protect this space in the future. Leaving it up to the university solely to, continue to sort of balance these economic needs with natural spaces, I think leaves the door open for this conversation to take place again in the future, particularly as more and more development occurs in the surrounding area, there will only be more sort of interest in carving up this last remaining wild area. And so what I have called for, and this is what I've called for from the very beginning of this this fight to protect the preserve, is for an easement to be placed on it.
We're speaking with Dr. Jeannie Munger, a member of the Save USF Forest Preserve, also part of the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee. That committee just came up with its recommendations for the area that includes the Forest Preserve and a golf course that's north of the USF Tampa campus. So Jeannie, and I want to remind people also that you're listening to WMNF Tampa 88.5 FM. I'm Seán Kinane. This is the Tuesday Cafe. And Jeannie, this conservation easement that you were pushing for, what were the discussions like? Did you bring that up in the committee, and was there pushback, and how did that go?
Yes, I brought it up several times, and what I found really was kind of a refusal from other committee members to even take up the discussion in earnest. When we first convened the committee, we had one meeting that exclusively discussed the forest preserve, and then the remaining meetings really focused on the golf course, which, you know, understandably is a little bit more of a nuanced issue because it is a space that has already been developed to a certain extent. And so, you know, weighing the economic benefits of development with natural spaces is a bit more, you know, fine-grained. But I was very disheartened by the lack of discussion of the forest preserve specifically, and by the lack of discussion of a conservation easement. The discussion that did take place, essentially we were told that the university doesn't have the purview to place a conservation easement on the property. And this is because USF leases the land from the state of Florida. And so in order for a conservation easement to be placed on the property, we would need legislative approval. So we would have to go to the state of Florida and ask them to change the law in order to put this easement on the property. However, it's not unprecedented for land trust like Conservation Florida, for instance, to partner with a university to place a conservation easement on a piece of property that's in university holding but owned by the state of Florida. In fact, the University of Central Florida has just such an arrangement. So I was a little disheartened by, like I said, the lack of discussion about this as an option, particularly because in the ecological assessment that was conducted by Height Design, this is the assessment that was contracted by Interim President Law, they actually recommend a conservation easement for portions of the forest preserve. So I felt like I said, the discussion was not sufficient.
In the dissent letter that you sent to USF President Law yesterday, the recommendation that you were talking about by that design company said a conservation easement would be an appropriate measure for lands of such great ecological significance.
That's correct. Yes, they specifically refer to the wetlands, but also there is reference within that ecological assessment that denotes the significance of the other areas, the upland areas specifically that are sandhill.
Dr. Jeannie Munger is a member of Save USF Forest Preserve and was part of the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee. It came up with its recommendations for the area that includes the forest preserve and a golf course. We started to talk about the golf course. We'll definitely come back to that in just a second. I want to do that. But one of the things that the recommendations that this committee put out, it talked about some improvements that could happen to the property, like research and teaching facilities and some boardwalks. Would you favor things like buildings and research and teaching facilities and boardwalks on the property of the USF Forest Preserve?
Yes, with a huge asterisk next to it. So I think that elevated boardwalks might be a really great idea to, make portions of the forest preserve more accessible to students and more accessible to certain kinds of research. I think as well that we actually do have some larger, well, I don't want to say large, they're not that big. We do have some research items within the forest preserve currently. So I don't think a small research outbuilding would be a significant detriment to the ecosystem there. But I would be very hesitant to increase our footprint on the preserve, given that it's actually a fairly small piece of land, the upland area specifically, and given the sensitivity of those uplands.
The North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee's recommendations also said that the USF Forest Preserve likely provides a simultaneous opportunity for wetland mitigation. So wait a second, are we talking about keeping these wetlands pure in order to allow some developer somewhere else to destroy wetlands?
Well, that is what mitigation banking is. And in earlier drafts of our recommendation, we actually specifically stated that we did not agree with mitigation banking. And I was incredibly disappointed to find that the final draft included a recommendation for mitigation banking, but not for a conservation easement. In case people aren't aware, just like you said, Seán, mitigation banking sounds good. It sounds like we're restoring wetlands or we're preserving wetlands, but what it actually means is that potentially a developer can develop on more pristine ecosystems and then preserve a more denuded wetland for restoration. But that isn't exactly a net gain for ecosystems in Florida.
Our guest is Dr. Jeannie Munger. She's a member of the Save USF Forest Preserve. She was also part of the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee. It has sent its recommendations to the president of USF for the area that includes the forest preserve and a golf course. And of course, you can follow all of our coverage of this issue on WMNF.org. And so getting to the question of what to do with the golf course that's adjacent to this USF Forest Preserve, as you mentioned, yes, there's been development there. It's not a natural habitat. But when considering development, the committee says of particular concern are effects on the hydrology of the adjoining areas, for example, surface and groundwater connections. So what would be, I know that I'm asking a loaded question, but yeah. So what? If they take a golf course and they put condos on this golf course, will that hurt anything?
Yes, and in fact, I, again, was a little disappointed that our recommendation didn't give more specific concerns. Certainly hydrology is a very predominant issue. Anytime you build on a piece of property, particularly one that might be adjacent to wetlands, you run the risk of altering the surrounding hydrology. And so when we talk about the hydrology of the USF Forest Preserve, we don't just mean sort of this piece of property in isolation. We're talking about the Cypress Creek tributary that flows into the Hillsborough River. And so more intensive development that might occur on the golf course could have significant impacts to the hydrology of that creek and to the hydrology of the Hillsborough River. In addition to that, and these are parts that didn't make it into the recommendation, you run the risk of accelerating invasive species encroachment, specifically plant species. Oftentimes these developed lands, the sort of buffer between the developed lands and the non-developed lands include a lot of invasive species, and the more you intensely develop them, the more those invasive species can encroach into these more natural areas. In addition to this, a significant part of that golf course is used as refugia for wildlife, and it's used as part of this wildlife corridor that we have shown stretches from the Cypress Creek floodplain all the way to the Green Swamp. And eliminating some of those upland areas will have consequences for the animals that use that area to traverse that corridor.
Our guest is Dr. Jeannie Munger, a member of the Save USF Forest Preserve. Jeannie was also part of the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee. It has just come up with recommendations for the area that includes the Forest Preserve and a golf course that's adjacent to it. These are north of Fletcher Avenue near the Tampa campus. And in the document, the committee recommended that the university give full consideration to development and improvement projects that appropriately balance revenue generating interests and fiscal responsibilities with the aspirations, goals, and values espoused by the university and guided by the principles established and referenced herein, and also that it should enlist participation of faculty. So you talked about those guiding principles, and you said how that was a helpful document, a useful and true document, but it still sounds like the fact that this really leaves the door open for future development, especially where that golf course is. As long as they make enough revenue to make it worthwhile, is how I'm reading it.
Yes, I think that that's a fair reading. And I think that certainly given the state of the golf course, and given the state of development in the surrounding area, I think the university is absolutely eyeing that piece of property for future developments. What that might look like, it's impossible for me to say personally. I think that my sort of pie in the sky idealistic thinking was that we could do something a lot more sort of progressive with that piece of property and keep it a green space and keep it accessible to students without having a high impact on the surrounding area. There are several key documents that have been adopted by the city of Tampa and Hillsborough County that talk about things like a lack of tree canopy, heat island effect, all the problems associated with losing green spaces in urban areas. And so, certainly I'm very disappointed that the university isn't thinking more sustainably and progressively about what can be done on the golf course to keep it a green space.
Well, I'm going to pull one that you might not be ready for this one. So if you don't want to answer, no problem. But on a personal note, you're off on a new adventure in your professional life. Do you want to tell people where you'll be coming up next?
Sure. Yes, I accepted a postdoctoral research position at the University of Turku in Finland, and I will be studying how climate change is impacting plant microbe interactions at the poles.
Well, even though you're there, it's possible I'll still reach out to you to talk about the USF Forest Preserve, or if you have any other interesting research that you want to share with our listeners here in the Tampa Bay area. But before I let you go, where can people find out more about the USF Forest Preserve?
Sure, you can visit saveusfforestpreserve.com, and from there you can find all of our social media handles, as well as Friends of University Natural Areas, which is the nonprofit myself and other co-organizers of Save USF Forest Preserve have formed to provide ecological stewardship, education, and advocacy for not just the Forest Preserve, but other lands in university holdings.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on WMNF's Tuesday Cafe, Jeannie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Jeannie Munger is a member of Save USF Forest Preserve and was part of the North Fletcher Property Advisory Committee, which has just come up with recommendations for the area that includes the Forest Preserve and a golf course. You can see all of our coverage on this issue on WMNF.org. In a moment, we're going to be joined by our next guest, the president of Stand with Parkland, the National Association of Families for Safe Schools, as we approach the 4-year anniversary of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after this short music break on WMNF's Tuesday Cafe with Seán Kinane. You're listening to 88.5 FM and WMNF.org.